The U.S. Heartland China Association and John Deere have a lot in common. I say that because there are few things more important to us at Deere.
John Deere, one of America's most iconic manufacturers and a cornerstone of the country's agricultural and construction machinery industry, has long represented the heart of American industrial prowess. For decades, its sprawling factories and deeply rooted Midwestern operations symbolized more than just heavy machinery. They stood as emblems of innovation, consistency, and loyalty to American labor. However, the company now faces an unprecedented shift in direction. With Donald Trump's return to the presidency and his immediate imposition of sweeping tariffs on major trade partners, John Deere CEO John May has taken a bold and controversial step. In a move that sent shockwaves through manufacturing communities and global markets alike, May has decided to shut down significant production operations within the United States and transition those efforts overseas. Before we start, smash the like and subscribe buttons for more updates. This decision is not a sudden whim, but the culmination of complex economic pressures exacerbated by the new trade policy. As soon as President Trump announced the reinstatement and expansion of tariffs on key trade partners, the global response was swift. Many countries retaliated with tariffs of their own, specifically targeting American agricultural machinery, which is heavily exported. For a company like John Deere, whose international sales account for a substantial portion of revenue, these retaliatory measures posed a devastating blow. The cost of American-made equipment quickly became uncompetitive in global markets. Once the tariffs were in place, buyers from Latin America, Europe, and Asia began turning to more affordable alternatives from companies based in non-tariff nations. Within weeks, John Deere executives were watching international sales orders plummet, dealers grow uncertain, and long-standing trade relationships begin to fracture. Internally, the company was already grappling with a volatile market. Rising labor costs, inflationary pressure on materials, and an increasingly uncertain regulatory environment had already placed strain on their US-based operations. The tariffs were the final nail. In boardroom meetings marked by tension and urgency, the leadership team weighed their options. Either weather an economic storm that could last years and risk losing international competitiveness entirely, or restructure production to protect the company's global footprint. The latter path, while controversial and politically sensitive, became the only viable course. John May's decision to move production abroad was not made lightly. John Deere employs thousands of workers across multiple U.S. states, and the ripple effects of this move are vast. Entire towns have grown around John Deere facilities. Schools, local businesses, housing markets, and municipal budgets are inextricably linked to the health of these manufacturing plants. The announcement of the closures was met with immediate concern. Workers who had spent decades with the company faced the prospect of unemployment. Local leaders began holding emergency meetings to assess the economic fallout. The move did not just affect a single company, it sent a broader message about the fragility of American manufacturing under hostile trade conditions. Abroad, the company began mobilizing rapidly. Existing facilities in countries such as Mexico, Brazil, and Germany began ramping up capacity. New investments were announced in emerging markets where labor costs were lower, materials were cheaper, and trade restrictions were minimal or non-existent. These regions welcomed the shift eagerly. Governments in host countries saw an opportunity to inject life into their own economies. Incentives were offered, regulations fast-tracked, and logistical support made readily available. In a matter of months, the landscape of John Deere's production apparatus had dramatically changed. What makes this development particularly significant is the historical weight John Deere carries in the American psyche. This was not just another company outsourcing for convenience. It was a deeply American institution being pushed out by policy decisions that were ostensibly aimed at protecting American jobs. The irony was sharp. President Trump's strategy was intended to bring manufacturing back to the U.S., but for companies that depend on global markets, it had the opposite effect. Protectionism, when applied indiscriminately, creates an environment where multinational companies are forced to act against domestic interest in order to survive globally. The economic logic behind May's move was clear. If the cost of producing in the U.S. made exports unsellable, then production had to go where demand could be met affordably. American soil once fertile ground for industrial expansion, had become inhospitable terrain under the weight of tariffs. Production abroad allowed John Deere to maintain its pricing competitiveness, preserve international market share, and sustain overall profitability. Without this strategic pivot, the company risked not only diminished sales, but potential obsolescence in markets where foreign competitors were aggressively capitalizing on America's isolation. Domestically, the political fallout was swift. News outlets buzzed with debates over patriotism versus pragmatism. Some critics lambasted May's decision as un-American, accusing him of abandoning the country in a time of economic reorientation. Others defended it as a necessary response to damaging policy choices. Economists entered the fray, highlighting how tariffs, when applied without nuance, often produce unintended consequences. Far from bringing jobs back, they can drive them away, especially in sectors heavily tied to global trade flows. Labor unions that had traditionally worked closely with John Deere were caught in a difficult position. On one hand, they had fought hard for decades to keep manufacturing jobs in the U.S., often pushing back against even small shifts in operations abroad. On the other hand, they could not ignore the cold economic reality that the company was presenting. As international sales dried up, there would simply be no work to support existing labor forces. The very workers they sought to protect were now at risk of losing everything unless the company adapted. Tensions grew between union leadership, local chapters, and the corporation, as each side struggled to manage the fallout in a rapidly changing industrial landscape. This was not the first time John Deere had dealt with international manufacturing decisions, but never before had the shift been so public, so large-scale, or so tied to a specific political event. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. While American flags still flew at shuttered factories, machinery began rolling out of new plants thousands of miles away. Even as the company maintained its headquarters in Moline, Illinois, and kept some specialized operations in the U.S., the production core had shifted. Economically, John Deere remained stable, but emotionally and politically, the rupture was deep. Beyond the company, other industries watched closely. If a giant like John Deere could make such a move in response to trade policy, who might follow next? The implications stretched far beyond agriculture and construction equipment. Auto manufacturers, aerospace firms, and even high-tech industries were reevaluating their positions. Trade policy had suddenly become a trigger point for massive logistical restructuring. Countries that had once been considered secondary players in global manufacturing were now being eyed as potential new homes for American industrial giants. Financial markets reacted with cautious optimism. While John Deere's stock experienced some volatility following the announcement, investors appreciated the company's proactive stance. Long-term outlooks began to improve as analysts factored in the cost savings and market stabilization from overseas operations. Yet at the same time, questions loomed about the future of U.S.-based manufacturing investment. If the environment remained hostile to exports, then more companies might see no alternative but to move. Community response, however, was anything but optimistic. In towns like Waterloo, Iowa, where John Deere has deep roots, the announcement felt like a betrayal. Entire families with generations of workers suddenly faced uncertain futures. Local economies braced for a downturn. Small businesses that depended on the steady flow of income from John Deere employees began planning for layoffs and closures of their own. School districts anticipated budget shortfalls as property values declined and tax revenues dropped. Civic pride took a hit too. The name John Deere had been a point of identity and pride. Now it felt like a memory in retreat. From a geopolitical standpoint, the move highlighted the growing tension between domestic policy and global economic integration. Trump's administration had made clear its priority was American industrial resurgence, but the tools being used, especially broad tariffs, were increasingly seen as blunt instruments in a nuanced global marketplace. For export-reliant companies, these policies imposed a new layer of complexity that made domestic production a risk rather than an asset. John May's decision stood as a case study in this tension. It demonstrated how even the most American of companies could be driven away when policy becomes a barrier to business. The operational shift also triggered logistical challenges. Supply chains had to be redesigned almost overnight. Engineers and designers had to coordinate across time zones. Compliance with foreign labor laws and environmental standards became urgent priorities. Despite these hurdles, the company proceeded with remarkable speed. It had no choice. Every day lost to indecision meant further erosion of market confidence and brand presence in vital regions. For John Deere, the long-term objective was sustainability of revenue, reach, and relevance. In moving production abroad, the company positioned itself not as an American manufacturer, but as a global one with American heritage. This redefinition was necessary for survival, but came at the cost of legacy. It reoriented not just factories, but identity. The familiar green and yellow machines would still populate fields and work sites around the world, but increasingly, they would bear the imprint of production from outside American borders. All eyes remained on the evolving situation. Would Trump's administration adjust its approach in light of these unintended consequences? Would other companies follow John Deere's lead? Would the outcry from communities force political recalibration? For now, those questions remained unanswered. What was clear, however, was that the intersection of policy and production had reached a critical juncture. John Deere's move was more than a business decision. It was a landmark moment in the broader story of American industry in the 21st century. The implications extend into education, regional planning, and even national discourse about the future of work. Universities and trade schools that once funneled graduates into Deere's operations began reassessing their programs. Economic development agencies found themselves scrambling to attract new industries to fill the void. Meanwhile, political candidates began adjusting their messaging, aware that the ground had shifted beneath their feet. Tariffs, once heralded by some as tools of strength, were now under scrutiny for their real-world impact. For John May, the path forward was fraught but calculated. He knew the backlash would be fierce, but the alternative was worse. In staying the course, he preserved a future for the company, albeit at the cost of its domestic roots. In doing so, he underscored a reality that many prefer to ignore. In a globalized economy, national borders cannot dictate business strategy when survival is at stake. The world had changed. So had John Deere. Whether America changes in response or resists and suffers the consequences remains to be seen. While John Deere's sudden pivot away from domestic production sparked immediate national debate, the longer-term ramifications began unfolding across layers of economic, industrial, and geopolitical landscapes with deep complexity. The company's decision didn't just affect current operations, it began to recalibrate how global manufacturing networks might evolve under the pressures of nationalistic trade policy. As analysts, corporations, governments, and citizens adjusted to the new reality, it became increasingly clear that this moment marked a fundamental turning point for the structure of American industry. With the production shift underway, the logistics behind the transition presented significant new challenges and learning curves for the company. Relocating advanced manufacturing operations is far more complex than simply moving machinery or reopening in new regions. It requires rebuilding entire operational ecosystems. Skilled labor must be retrained or recruited. Supply chains, finely tuned to the rhythms of U.S. distribution, must be dismantled and replaced. Shipping routes, warehousing strategies, inventory management, and customs compliance all need to be reimagined. These are not tasks that can be solved with a single boardroom decision. They demand coordinated efforts across continents. One of the most demanding aspects of the shift involved technology transfer. John Deere's manufacturing methods are not plug-and-play. They depend on sophisticated robotics, proprietary assembly line techniques, and integrated software systems that communicate between engineering teams and factory floors. Transferring this knowledge from seasoned American workers to new hires in foreign plants meant rethinking not just logistics, but training philosophy. To replicate the precision and quality long associated with the John Deere name, the company had to invest heavily in education, support infrastructure, and localized managerial capacity. Months of immersive workshops, virtual simulations, and live practice sessions became the norm as new facilities prepared to mirror the performance of their American predecessors. Another hidden consequence of this relocation was the disruption of domestic innovation pipelines. John Deere, like many advanced manufacturers, relies not only on physical production, but on a close relationship between engineers, designers, and assembly teams. Having production and development teams geographically close enables quick feedback loops, problem solving, and iteration. Separating those components by thousands of miles risked slowing innovation. Ideas that once evolved through daily face-to-face collaboration now had to be conveyed through digital channels, often across multiple time zones and cultural barriers. Even with modern communication tools, the richness of real-time collaboration took a hit. This change also threatened the strength of America's broader innovation ecosystem. The ripple effect of John Deere's departure began reaching academic and research institutions. Universities and technical colleges that had built partnerships with the company saw funding dry up and internship programs vanish. Research grants previously backed by John Deere for developing new materials, efficiency models, and automation algorithms disappeared. The downstream effect on American innovation was subtle but profound, a weakening of the symbiotic link between corporate manufacturing and academic discovery. In contrast, nations welcoming the new factories found themselves on the receiving end of a windfall. Not only did they gain jobs and economic growth, but they also inherited technological expertise and innovation leadership. Countries like India and Vietnam, already hungry for technological advancement, embraced this opportunity with enthusiasm. Government leaders touted the influx of knowledge and investment as proof of their rising global stature. Local universities quickly moved to establish new partnerships with John Deere, tailoring curricula to match the company's needs and creating pipelines of young, skilled engineers. The same relationships being severed in the US were now blossoming abroad, tilting the global balance of manufacturing knowledge. As foreign facilities grew stronger and more competent, a secondary shift emerged: the potential relocation of research and development itself. With manufacturing now centered overseas, logistical and economic logic began favoring R&D facilities near production hubs. Engineers embedded near factory floors could test prototypes faster, refine materials more responsively, and reduce the time from idea to implementation. This trend further deepened the impact on the U.S. workforce. It wasn't just welders and machinists being phased out. It was software developers, electrical engineers, and design specialists. Jobs once considered insulated from globalization began drifting offshore, not because of wage competition, but because of systemic efficiency. Meanwhile, the psychological impact on the American manufacturing identity intensified. Historically, industries like steel, automotive, and heavy machinery were seen as the backbone of American economic might. John Deere's retreat challenged that perception in real time. For workers who had grown up hearing that manufacturing jobs were coming back, the closure of local plants felt like a betrayal not just by a company, but by a national narrative. A growing sense of disillusionment began to spread through industrial regions already hollowed out by decades of outsourcing. Communities that had pinned hopes on a manufacturing renaissance were now forced to reckon with the brutal reality that even the most iconic manufacturers could be driven away by poor policy alignment. The economic stress on these communities did not operate in isolation. Banks and credit unions in affected towns began reporting increased default risks on home and auto loans. Real estate markets, once stable due to the anchor of John Deere employment, cooled quickly as uncertainty set in. Healthcare facilities, often dependent on employer-sponsored insurance coverage, braced for budget shortfalls. Restaurants, car dealerships, and daycare centers saw dwindling foot traffic. Local governments, heavily reliant on tax revenues from large employers, began forecasting deficits. In some counties, budget cuts to public services were already being drafted within weeks of the announcement. At the same time, the U.S. government was forced to confront the unintended consequences of its own actions. While the tariffs were implemented with the goal of restoring American industrial dominance, they triggered a chain reaction that produced the opposite effect. For economists and policymakers alike, John Deere became a high-profile example of policy backfire, an object lesson in the dangers of economic nationalism in a deeply interconnected world. Rather than coaxing companies into expanding domestically, the tariffs boxed them into untenable situations. For export-heavy sectors, the penalty for staying home became too steep to bear. Even within the Republican Party, debate began to emerge. Some lawmakers, long aligned with pro-business ideology, were now caught in a bind. Supporting Trump's aggressive trade stance risked alienating corporate allies and job creators. Opposing it meant confronting the president's core political message. In congressional hearings and private donor circles, the fracture lines became visible. The business community, traditionally a bedrock of conservative support, began whispering its dissatisfaction more loudly. Industry groups representing manufacturers, exporters, and agricultural interests released a flurry of position papers, all warning that the John Deere situation could easily become a pattern. Internationally, trade partners seized the moment. Countries previously wary of economic alignment with the U.S. began expanding ties with China, the EU, and regional blocs. New trade agreements were inked, specifically excluding the U.S. or reducing its bargaining power. John Deere, as a multinational presence, found itself adjusting to this new geopolitical chessboard. The company had to navigate not only different legal systems and regulatory environments, but also a shifting landscape of trade alliances that increasingly marginalized American influence. Simultaneously, this shift in production set off environmental debates. Some environmental groups expressed concern that the move might lead to laxer environmental standards, especially if new factories were placed in countries with weaker regulatory oversight. John Deere, known for its emphasis on sustainable technology, faced pressure to maintain high standards regardless of geography. The company responded by publicly committing to international green standards, but environmental watchdogs remained skeptical. Critics questioned whether cost-saving motives would inevitably erode the quality of emissions controls, energy sourcing, or waste management in new plants. In the labor sphere, the vacuum left behind by John Deere attracted the attention of political organizers and progressive movements. Some saw this as a rallying point to push for stronger labor protections, universal retraining programs, or even a reinvention of American industrial policy. Calls for a modern-day New Deal began to echo in political speeches and campaign proposals. The idea wasn't simply to bring back old jobs, but to redefine the American labor future with resilience, flexibility, and investment in emerging technologies. While these ideas gained traction in some corners, they remained aspirational for the many families immediately affected by job losses. Technology firms, too, began reevaluating their strategies. As automation and AI continued to reshape labor needs, some companies saw the John Deere transition as a test case. Could automation offset the need for geographic relocation? Could digital twins, robotics, and AI-assisted manufacturing close the gap between cost and location? Several firms began proposing partnerships with manufacturing giants to build hybrid production models where physical labor abroad could be supplemented by US-based remote supervision, design, and predictive maintenance teams. These new paradigms were experimental but hinted at a future where geography mattered less, if the technology could keep up. In education, vocational schools began to pivot. Recognizing that traditional manufacturing paths were becoming more volatile, many institutions began redesigning programs around digital manufacturing, industrial AI, and robotics. Students were now being taught not just to operate machinery, but to program, troubleshoot, and adapt systems in real time. Ironically, John Deere's exit accelerated a kind of educational evolution, one that might eventually equip the next generation to compete in an industrial world that no longer followed the rules of their parents' era. Yet, for all the adaptation and reinvention, a sense of loss still hung heavily in the air. There is something deeply unsettling about seeing a piece of the national industrial soul shift away, not because of market failures, but because of policy miscalculations. The tractors still worked, the machines were still needed, the company was still profitable, and yet the equation no longer favored the country where it all began. That contradiction gnawed at the edges of public consciousness. In global markets, competitors seized their moment. European and Asian machinery manufacturers aggressively targeted former John Deere customers, often advertising themselves as more stable, less politically entangled, and more responsive to international needs. Marketing campaigns began to highlight tariff-free reliability, painting American brands as unpredictable. Some markets that had once been loyal to John Deere now considered switching permanently. Brand loyalty, once rock solid, began to erode under the pressure of economic necessity. For John Deere, long-term success would depend on maintaining the integrity of its products while navigating these geopolitical minefields. The company could not afford quality lapses, supply disruptions, or PR missteps. Every tractor and loader that rolled off a foreign assembly line would need to prove that the legacy of American excellence had not been lost in translation. The brand's reputation, painstakingly built over more than a century, now had to withstand the scrutiny of skeptics on all sides: loyal customers, disappointed workers, angry politicians, and global competitors. Meanwhile, the larger story continued to unfold. A major American employer had restructured itself globally, not due to competitive failure, but as a defensive measure against its own government's actions. That reality would haunt policymakers and political strategists for years. It would fuel think tanks, drive campaign debates, and rewrite economic textbooks. And for all its implications, economic, emotional, logistical, political, John Deere's move stood as a single data point in what might become a broader trend. As the implications of John Deere's dramatic shift continued to unfold, a quiet but potent transformation was occurring within the corporate architecture of global commerce. At the center of it stood a single, undeniable reality: the traditional map of manufacturing, once grounded in physical borders, national pride, and historical identity, was dissolving into a web of interest dictated by fluid economics, real-time data, and international supply logic. With John Deere's pivot away from domestic production, a deeper, more permanent recalibration was underway, one that extended far beyond tractors and tariffs. In the halls of multinational corporations, John Deere's move became a reference point, studied by executives as a strategic benchmark. It demonstrated that in a high-stakes regulatory environment, companies must prioritize operational flexibility above all else. Boardrooms across sectors ranging from industrial equipment to pharmaceuticals to consumer electronics began developing contingency frameworks that mirrored Deere's rapid transition. This event was not seen as isolated, but as a case study in preemptive corporate adaptation. The agility John Deere displayed was not merely a business advantage. It had become a survival strategy in a world where domestic policy could, with one announcement, disrupt a decade of global planning. One of the more overlooked consequences of John Deere's move was the subtle but widespread evolution of corporate diplomacy. Historically, multinational firms have maintained quiet, behind-the-scenes relationships with foreign governments. Now such relationships were elevated to primary strategic concerns. In relocating production abroad, John Deere had to become more than a manufacturer. It had to be a partner, a negotiator, and a cultural translator. Governments in host countries were no longer just regulators. They became co-stakeholders, collaborators, and in some cases, active participants in the growth of a global brand. In Brazil, for example, where John Deere had existing but limited operations, the sudden expansion invited both enthusiasm and complexity. Brazilian officials moved quickly to offer incentives, land grants, expedited licensing, reduced energy tariffs, to help secure their role as a primary production hub. In return, they expected long-term commitments, investment in infrastructure, partnerships with local education institutions, and a visible role in rural economic development. What had once been an outsourced auxiliary plant was now being groomed to become a central pillar of John Deere's future. This arrangement required delicate negotiations, balancing local aspirations with global performance goals. Similarly, in Southeast Asia, John Deere found itself entering environments where economic growth and political stability were not always guaranteed. Vietnam, a rising star in global manufacturing due to its favorable labor costs and young workforce, welcomed the opportunity to become a more significant player. Yet the country's infrastructure, particularly its port access, energy grid, and legal frameworks, required swift modernization to meet the scale John Deere demanded. This forced the company into a role it rarely played, as a catalyst for national infrastructure development. Deere's logistical demands quickly became tied to the expansion of highways, improvements in container port capacity, and reforms in commercial litigation procedures. This direct entanglement with foreign infrastructure projects marked a substantial shift in the character of American multinational business. No longer could companies simply move production and expect the host country to adapt. Now, companies had to co-develop. This created an entirely new layer of complexity, especially as the host nations began to leverage the presence of companies like John Deere for their own geopolitical positioning. Being home to such a company became a source of soft power, an indication of international legitimacy, economic maturity, and global integration. This newfound symbiosis raised questions within the corridors of U.S. government agencies tasked with monitoring international investment and security. Suddenly, American corporations were deeply embedded in the infrastructure of potentially rival nations. What if political winds shifted? What if these same countries, once economic allies, became strategic competitors? By relocating vital manufacturing operations, were companies like John Deere inadvertently transferring more than just jobs, perhaps also technological knowledge, production blueprints, and strategic leverage? If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on John Deere moving abroad? Will Trump's tariffs backfire? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.